Holly didn't remember getting out of bed. One moment she was staring at her phone, the words "cryptid pursuit is live" burning into her retinas, and the next she was in her living room, laptop open, fingers trembling against the keyboard. The video feed was still up. The chat had slowed, uncertainty settling in as viewers tried to make sense of what they had just seen. Wayne's voice, if it had been his, still echoed in her head. She replayed it, forcing herself to listen. "Holly." Her throat tightened. It wasn't right. The tone, the cadence, it was close, but the edges were wrong, stretched in ways that a voice shouldn't be. It lingered too long on the consonants, like something unfamiliar with the mechanics of speech was trying to wear the name. A new message appeared in the chat. "You hearing this?" More followed. "That wasn't Wayne." "Who's running the account?" "Check the VOD, it's already gone." Holly switched to the archive tab, but the live stream wasn't there. It hadn't been saved. Her stomach twisted. That wasn't how the platform worked. Even if the account owner deleted a video, there was usually a delay. But this had vanished instantly, as though it had never been uploaded at all. Another message scrolled by, standing out from the rest. "Rewind." She frowned. Rewind? She clicked back to the live feed. The screen was black. There was no audio. But the timestamp. It was still running. The stream was still on. Holly hesitated, then dragged the playback bar backward. The darkness gave way to grainy movement. Her breath caught, the camera had shifted. It no longer pointed at the empty trees. Instead, it had turned, angled slightly upward, aimed toward a break in the branches. Through the gaps, the night sky was barely visible, the stars obscured by drifting mist. For a moment, nothing happened, and then the lighting changed. The shadows deepened and stretched, distorting into unfamiliar shapes. The chat exploded. Did that just move? Rewind, look at the tree on the left. Something standing there. Holly's fingers went numb. She squinted at the frame, forcing her eyes to focus. The movement had been subtle, but it was there. Something had stepped into view. She rewound a few seconds, watching again. At first, the trees were empty. Then, in a single, unnatural motion, a shape appeared, seemingly out of thin air. It stood at the edge of the frame, barely distinguishable from the darkness, its form human but wrong. The proportions were just slightly off. Its limbs were held too stiff, and its head was tilted too far, with the suggestion of a mouth set in an expression that didn't belong. The longer Holly stared, the more certain she became. It was facing the camera. It knew they were watching it. Another whisper rose from the speakers, "Hello." Holly jerked back. It wasn't Wayne's voice this time, or hers. She reached for the laptop instinctively, as if she could shove it away and shut it off, but the video feed froze. The audio cut out mid-whisper, and the screen went black. The chat continued for another few seconds before stopping entirely. And then, with no warning, a final message appeared in the center of the screen: "We are only getting started." Holly didn't sleep. She sat curled in her desk chair, staring at the dark monitor long after the stream ended, long after the chat had fallen silent. Her mind refused to settle. She had been so certain that it was a hoax. That someone had hacked the account, tampered with old footage, or manipulated the broadcast. But deep down, something clawed at the edge of that certainty, a whisper of doubt threading through her thoughts. Because she had seen it, the thing standing in the trees. She pulled up her phone, fingers unsteady. Her first instinct was to text someone, anyone, but she hesitated over the keyboard, unsure of what to say. Instead, she scrolled back to the last messages she had sent to Wayne, just over a week ago. "You guys alive?" "The chat's losing their minds." "Seriously, text back." The messages had never been opened. She swallowed hard and exited the thread, switching instead to her call log. Wayne's number was still there. She hovered over it. "Don't be stupid," she told herself. It won't connect. It's just a number. Her thumb moved before she could stop herself. The call rang twice, then picked up. She heard nothing but silence. Holly froze. Wayne. The static was faint, but it was there. And then, something whispered. Hello. It was the same voice from the stream. She ended the call immediately, her hands shaking. Before she could process what had just happened, a notification popped up, Cryptid Pursuit is live. Holly's stomach lurched. She didn't open it. She didn't want to see. Her phone buzzed again. A text, with no name attached. It was just a single message, see you soon. Detective Riggins stared at the transcript, his lips pressed into a tight line. He had never cared for the cryptid nonsense. He had spent too much of his career dealing with actual cases, missing persons, unsolved deaths, things that had explanations, even if they weren't good ones. But this was something different. The stream had ended, but the account was still active. The logs were still populating, filling with messages from viewers who didn't know whether they had witnessed a prank or something else entirely. And Holly Tran had gone silent. Her last known activity was an outgoing call to a disconnected number. Her apartment was empty. There were no signs of forced entry or of a struggle. The only thing even remotely out of place was her laptop, left open on her desk. The screen was black, and the cursor blinked over an unfinished message in the chat, "It's not him." Detective Riggins wasn't a man easily rattled. Years of law enforcement had dulled his nerves to most things, gruesome crime scenes, grieving families, cases that went cold before they had the chance to thaw. He had seen bodies in worse conditions than the ones they had pulled from Blackwood National Forest. He had even handled cases involving missing persons who had turned up later, so altered by whatever they had experienced that they barely resembled who they had been before. But this was different. The transcript of the final Cryptid Pursuit stream sat on his desk, printed out in its entirety. He had read through it twice already, trying to convince himself that the hysteria of an online audience had blurred the truth. Yet the details remained the same. Wayne and Wes had been running. From what, no one could say. The footage was too chaotic to pinpoint a single threat, but the chat had noticed something. Glimpses of an extra figure. Overlapping voices that shouldn't have been there. The final moments, where Wayne had turned to Wes, only for the chat to explode with messages screaming, "That's not Wes." Riggins exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Holly Tran had been his best chance at figuring out what had happened that night. She had known Wayne and Wes better than anyone. She had spent years moderating their content, keeping things organized. If there had been a hoax, she would have been the one to uncover it. But now she was missing. Her apartment had shown no signs of forced entry. Her phone was still there, resting neatly on her nightstand. No calls had been placed from it in the past 12 hours. At least, none that made sense. Except for one, a call placed to a disconnected number, Wayne Carter's number. Detective Riggins stared at the transcript, his lips pressed into a tight line. He had never cared for the cryptid nonsense. He had spent too much of his career dealing with actual cases, missing persons, unsolved deaths, things that had explanations, even if they weren't good ones. But this was something different. The stream had ended, but the account was still active. The logs were still populating, filling with messages from viewers who didn't know whether they had witnessed a prank or something else entirely. And Holly Tran had gone silent. Her last known activity was an outgoing call to a disconnected number. Her apartment was empty. There were no signs of forced entry or of a struggle. The only thing even remotely out of place was her laptop, left open on her desk. The screen was black, and the cursor blinked over an unfinished message in the chat, "It's not him." Detective Riggins wasn't a man easily rattled. Years of law enforcement had dulled his nerves to most things, gruesome crime scenes, grieving families, cases that went cold before they had the chance to thaw. He had seen bodies in worse conditions than the ones they had pulled from Blackwood National Forest. He had even handled cases involving missing persons who had turned up later, so altered by whatever they had experienced that they barely resembled who they had been before. But this was different. The transcript of the final cryptid pursuit stream sat on his desk, printed out in its entirety. He had read through it twice already, trying to convince himself that the hysteria of an online audience had blurred the truth. Yet the details remained the same. Wayne and Wes had been running. From what, no one could say. The footage was too chaotic to pinpoint a single threat, but the chat had noticed something. Glimpses of an extra figure. Overlapping voices that shouldn't have been there. The final moments, where Wayne had turned to Wes, only for the chat to explode with messages screaming, "That's not Wes." Riggins exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Holly Tran had been his best chance at figuring out what had happened that night. She had known Wayne and Wes better than anyone. She had spent years moderating their content, keeping things organized. If there had been a hoax, she would have been the one to uncover it. But now she was missing. Her apartment had shown no signs of forced entry. Her phone was still there, resting neatly on her nightstand. No calls had been placed from it in the past 12 hours, at least, none that made sense. Except for one, a call placed to a disconnected number, Wayne Carter's number. Riggins stared at the record, then back at the transcript. Something didn't fit. He leaned back in his chair, letting the pieces rearrange themselves in his mind. Wayne and Wes had fled something in the forest. They had been terrified, their voices raw with panic. But their bodies had been found sitting against trees, their heads tilted and their limbs arranged. There were no signs of a struggle, and no defensive wounds. Riggins had been a cop for over 2 decades. He knew what it looked like when someone was posed after death. Wayne and Wes hadn't been posed. They had sat down. The internet had already moved on. At least, that was how it looked on the surface. A few channels had covered the story, YouTubers speculating about the Imitator, debating whether the deaths were a hoax or something darker. Some claimed the whole thing had been an elaborate stunt, while others swore they had seen something in the trees. Holly wasn't sure why she kept scrolling through the comments. She wasn't even sure why she was still awake. She had packed a bag an hour ago, turned her phone off, shut her laptop, and convinced herself that she would leave town before morning, but she hadn't left. Instead, she had been staring at the black screen of her laptop, fingers frozen above the keyboard, waiting for something she couldn't name. She hadn't told anyone what had happened, not about the call, not about the voice. Not about how, after the cryptid pursuit account went live again, she had started noticing things in her apartment, a delay in her reflection when she passed a mirror, a half-heard whisper when she closed her eyes for too long. She had tried to ignore it, but she'd failed. Now, sitting in the dark, she felt the weight of something unseen pressing against her skin, like a static charge building in the air before a storm. Her fingers moved without thinking. She opened the chat logs again and scrolled to the last message she had typed, "It's not him." She didn't remember typing it. She had never hit send. And yet, there it was, frozen on the screen. She swallowed hard, and the screen flickered. For a fraction of a second, her reflection in the laptop monitor didn't match her movement. She slammed the screen shut. She was done waiting. The forest was wrong. Holly had expected the unease. She had spent years watching footage of these trees, listening to Wayne and Wes talk about the legends, the disappearances. But nothing had prepared her for standing at the edge of them, staring into the void beyond the trailhead. She gripped the flashlight tighter, forcing herself forward. She had to see the clearing for herself, the place where they had last been seen. She had already found their truck, still parked where they had left it. The doors were locked and the keys were gone, but there were footprints leading away from it, 2 sets going in, and none coming out. The trail stretched ahead of her, winding through the trees. The deeper she went, the quieter everything became. Her flashlight flickered, and Holly stopped. Ahead of her, just beyond the reach of the beam, the trees shifted. Amidst them, she she caught a glimpse of a shadow, taller than the others. She forced herself to take a step closer. The light wavered again, and for a moment, she could have sworn she saw a half-formed face, just barely visible, like a blurred reflection on water. "Holly," a voice said, interrupting the silence. She turned and ran. Her own name followed her, repeated in broken whispers, voices overlapping in a chorus of mimicry. She pushed herself forward, legs burning, branches clawing at her arms. The trail twisted in directions she didn't recognize, the path warping beneath her feet. Then she spotted a light, a break in the trees. She stumbled into the clearing, chest heaving, and stopped. There, at the center, stood two trees, and against them, there were two figures. Wayne and Wes. Holly's breath escaped her in a strangled gasp. They were sitting just as they had been found, but their eyes weren't open, and their heads weren't tilted. They weren't dead. They were waiting. Wayne moved first, his hands uncurling slowly. Then Wes's head lifted, and his mouth opened. Together, they repeated, "We're not done playing." Riggins stared at the laptop, jaw clenched. The new cryptid pursuit stream had ended hours ago. The footage was already gone. To make matters worse, Holly Tran was now missing, and something was still using their voices. He reached for his phone. He didn't know who he was calling, but he had a feeling that whoever answered wouldn't sound quite right. Detective Riggins sat in his car outside Holly Tran's apartment, listening to the faint hum of the radio beneath the quiet of the early morning. He had gone over the details 100 times, turning them over in his mind like puzzle pieces that refused to fit. 3 people were missing. 2 had been found dead. And yet, they were still talking. Riggins wasn't the type to get caught up in ghost stories. He had spent his life dealing with real horrors, murders, kidnappings, cases where the human mind twisted in ways it wasn't supposed to. But this wasn't human. He stared at the phone in his hand. The last number dialed was Holly's. The call had gone through. There was no voicemail or automated message telling him the line was disconnected. Someone had picked up. And for nearly 10 seconds, there had been nothing but breathing. Then, finally, a voice came through the line, saying just one word, "Paul." It wasn't distorted or unnatural, as Riggins had expected. It was surprisingly familiar, as if Holly herself had whispered his name through the receiver, waiting for him to respond. Still, Riggins had heard something layered beneath the word, like a second voice trying to produce the same tone. He had hung up immediately, gripping the wheel hard enough for his knuckles to turn white. He had wanted to tell himself it was just a trick of the mind, a bad connection, an echo through the speaker. But then the notification came through, "Cryptid Pursuit is live." The chat had been hesitant at first. A handful of viewers had tuned in, expecting another glitch, another broadcast that would disappear the second it ended. But when the stream stabilized and the screen flickered from black to grainy night vision, the numbers started climbing. People wanted answers. The first few messages Riggins scrolled through were cautious. "What is this? Who's running the account? Is that the forest?" The camera was moving, unsteady but controlled, as though someone was walking through the trees, filming the way forward. The angle was wrong, held too low, tilted slightly, but the forest was unmistakable. A thin mist coiled along the ground, swallowing the space between the trees. Then, a slow, shuddering breath interrupted the stillness, and the chat erupted. "Oh, hell no. Nope, nope, nope. Someone say something." The breathing continued, deep and measured, filling the silence. And then, someone whispered. "Hello." The word came softly, stretched slightly at the edges, like a voice pulled from memory. The cadence was off, just enough to unsettle anyone that heard it. More messages scrolled in. That sounded like Wayne. No, it sounded like Wes. Why does it sound like both? The camera paused, and the breathing continued. And then, in a voice that was almost Holly's, something spoke, "Come find me." Riggins wasn't sure why he was watching. He had told himself he wouldn't. He had seen the last one, had read through the logs, had listened to the recordings of whatever had spoken through Wayne and Wes's voices before the stream cut. But this was different. Holly was still missing, and now something was pretending to be her. The stream flickered as the camera moved again, tracking through the trees. The image was unsteady, but the path was familiar. Riggins leaned forward. He had seen this place before, it was where they had found the bodies. The two trees stood just ahead, the ground untouched since the day the forensic team had packed up and left. The scene was the same, the stillness, the eerie sense that something had been left unfinished. But something was different. There were footprints in the dirt, leading away from the trees. The camera tilted upward and, standing just beyond the clearing, there was a figure. The viewers lost their collective minds. Say something. Who the hell is that? It's Holly, right? Riggins tensed. The figure was standing too still, too straight. Then, it took a step forward. The chat exploded. It's her. Holly, say something. Why is she moving like that? Riggins didn't blink. The figure's movement was agonizingly slow, as though it was testing the mechanics of motion itself. And then, a voice spoke, Paul. The screen of Riggins's phone went black, but the call remained active. He inhaled sharply, jerking back. The voice whispered again. Come find me. The same words from the stream. Riggins tightened his hand around the phone. Where are you? The voice on the other end hesitated, but then spoke. I don't know. He stood so quickly that his chair scraped against the floor. The video feed was still running, and the camera was still aimed at the figure. The chat was unraveling, some users crying hoax, others swearing they had heard something in the background, another voice, layered beneath the first. But Riggins wasn't looking at the screen anymore. He was looking at the window behind his desk, at the reflection staring back at him. At a macabre facsimile of himself, and the way its head tilted a fraction too far. The breath stalled in his throat. Then, in a voice that was almost his own, something spoke. That was fun. Let's play again. The Cryptid Pursuit stream went offline at 3:17 a.m. The chat froze, the video disappeared, and the account was gone. For a few minutes, the internet panicked. Then, the first emails came in. Anonymous uploads. Fragments of footage. The same clip, sent to hundreds of users. The video was barely 20 seconds long. It was a shot of a window, with a reflection in the glass. The shape of a man stood behind it, watching from the other side, and over the final frame, everyone heard a voice, one last time, whispering a single word, over and over again, each utterance a sickening mockery of the voices of everyone who had disappeared. Hello. None of the victims were ever heard from again. Detective Riggins abruptly resigned a month later, and he, too, disappeared. From the outside, everyone assumed the pressure and the guilt had gotten to him. But those who had viewed the Cryptid Pursuit live streams knew better. They knew the reason why no one ever found the people gone missing in Blackwood National Forest. They knew there was something in the woods that studied Riggins and that, when it was ready, it became him.